Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. The Tower of the Hand felt more like a prison with each passing hour. Ned Stark stood before the tall windows of his solar, watching the sun set over King's Landing, painting the sky the color of blood. How fitting, he thought grimly. Blood would flow before this was finished, he was certain of it now. The parchment in his hands bore the seal of House Arryn, but the words written upon it might as well have been Jon Arryn's death warrant. The seed is strong. Such simple words to topple kingdoms. Ned had spent days following the trail his predecessor had left, visiting the same blacksmiths, speaking to the same bastards, seeing what Jon Arryn had seen in those final weeks of his life. Golden hair. Always golden hair, but in every true-born child of House Baratheon going back 300 years. They only had black hairs, yet Joffrey, Marcella, and Tommen all bore the golden locks of their mother's house. The seed is strong, but not strong enough to overcome the lion's blood that truly flowed in their veins. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, not turning from the window. "My lord," came Jory Castle's familiar voice. "You sent for me?" Ned finally turned, noting the tension in his captain's weathered face. Jory had served House Stark faithfully for decades, had been with them through Robert's rebellion, had earned the right to know what storm was approaching. "The letters I gave you, have they been sent?" "Aye, my lord. Ravens flew to White Harbor, the Dreadfort, and Last Hearth this morning. Coded as you instructed, but the message will be clear enough to those who need to understand it." Ned nodded. The letters had been carefully worded, requests for trade negotiations and harvest reports, that would mean nothing to casual observers but would alert his bannermen to begin quiet preparations. Jon's counsel from his last letter had been sound. Move carefully, but move quickly. "And our men here in the capital? 20 good men, all sworn to House Stark. They're ready, my lord, though I confess I'm not certain what they're ready for." Ned moved to his desk, where more parchments lay scattered. Records from the royal treasury, genealogies, witness accounts. The evidence of the Lannister deception was overwhelming, but evidence meant nothing without the power to act upon it. "They're ready for war, Jory, because that's what's coming." Before Jory could respond, another knock echoed through the chamber. This one was firmer, more insistent. Ned and Jory exchanged glances. They weren't expecting anyone. "Lord Stark?" The voice belonged to Ser Boros Blount of the Kingsguard. "Her Grace the Queen requests your immediate presence in the throne room." Requests. As if Ned had a choice in the matter, he could hear the implied threat in the knight's tone, could picture the other gold cloaks that would be waiting in the corridors. "Tell her Grace I'll attend her shortly," Ned replied, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his stomach. "I'm to escort you now, my lord." There it was, the iron fist beneath the velvet glove. Ned looked at Jory, seeing his own understanding reflected in the captain's eyes. This wasn't a request, it was a summoning. And summons from queens to lords who knew too much rarely ended well. "Very well." Ned straightened his doublet and checked that ice hung properly at his side. If this was to be a confrontation, he would face it as a Stark. "Jory, remain here. If I'm not back by dawn—" "My lord?" "You know what to do." The throne room was nearly empty when Ned arrived, which somehow made it more ominous than if it had been packed with courtiers. The iron throne loomed in the shadows, its twisted metal seeming to writhe in the flickering torchlight. But it wasn't King Robert who waited for him. It was Cersei, standing at the base of the throne's steps with her characteristic regal bearing. She wasn't alone. Jaime stood to her right, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt, while several Lannister guardsmen flanked the room's entrances. Ser Boros took his position behind Ned, completing the circle. "Lord Stark," Cersei said, her voice carrying across the vast chamber. "How good of you to join us." "Your Grace," Ned offered a respectful bow, though his eyes never left hers. "You wish to speak with me?" "I wish to discuss your recent activities. It seems you've been asking a great many questions around the city. Questions about bloodlines and legitimacy. Questions that might be considered treasonous." Ned felt his jaw tighten. So they knew. Of course they knew this was King's Landing, where secrets had a way of finding their way to the right ears for the right price. "I've been investigating the death of Jon Arryn, as is my duty as Hand of the King. Surely your Grace doesn't object to justice being served." Cersei's laugh was like breaking glass. "Justice? Is that what you call it? You've been spreading poison, Lord Stark, vile rumors that could destabilize the realm. The only poison here is the lie you've been living. The words came out harder than Ned intended, but he was past the point of diplomatic niceties. Jon Arryn died because he discovered the truth about your children, the truth about their parentage. The silence that followed was deafening. Jaime's hand tightened on his sword, and Ned could hear the soft scrape of steel being loosened in sheaths around the room. "Careful, Lord Stark," Jaime said quietly. "You're speaking of the royal children. Such accusations are not accusations," Ned interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "They are facts. Joffrey is not Robert's son, neither are Myrcella or Tommen. They are yours, Sir Jaime. Yours and your sister's." Cersei's mask finally slipped, revealing the cold fury beneath. "You have no proof." "I have all the proof I need. The genealogies, the witness accounts, the simple evidence of my own eyes. Robert's bastards all look like him. Dark hair, strong build, the Baratheon features. Your children look like Lannisters because they are Lannisters. All of them." "Even if that were true," Cersei said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "what do you think you can do about it? You're alone here, Lord Stark. Far from your frozen wasteland, surrounded by people who owe their loyalty to my family." "I'm not as alone as you think." Ned's hand moved to rest on Ice's pommel. "And I'm not as helpless as you hope." It was a bluff, but a necessary one. In truth, 20 men against the entire Lannister presence in King's Landing was hopeless odds, but Cersei didn't need to know that. "You think your northern honor will protect you here?" Cersei stepped closer, and Ned could see the madness dancing in her green eyes, the same madness that had driven her to commit incest and murder to protect her secrets. "This isn't Winterfell where men keep their word and honor their oaths. This is King's Landing where the only law is power." "Then let's test that theory." The voice came from behind the throne, and Ned's blood ran cold as a figure emerged from the shadows. Lord Petyr Baelish, his thin smile as sharp as a blade, walked casually down the steps as if he owned the Iron Throne itself. "Littlefinger," Ned said, his voice flat. "I should have known you'd be involved in this." "Oh, Lord Stark, I'm involved in everything. It's what makes life interesting." Petyr's mockingbird pin glinted in the torchlight as he moved to stand beside Cersei. "Though I must say, your investigation has been quite thorough, impressively so, really. You helped Jon Arryn," Ned realized. "You led him to the truth just as you led me. Guilty as charged, though in my defense, I never expected either of you to be quite so direct about it. Jon at least had the courtesy to die quietly. You, on the other hand, seemed determined to make a scene." Ned's mind raced, trying to understand the game being played around him. "Why? What do you gain from this?" "Chaos," Petyr said simply. "Chaos is a ladder, Lord Stark, and I've been climbing for a very long time." "Enough," Cersei snapped. "Lord Stark, you have a choice. You can forget what you think you know, return to Winterfell, and live out your days in peace, or you can pursue this madness and watch your family burn for it." "My family is very far away," Jaime interrupted, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "Winterfell is a long way from King's Landing. Accidents happen on the road. Bandits attack travelers. Children fall from towers." The mention of children sent ice through Ned's veins. Bran, who has now recovered from his fall, Arya and Sansa, innocent of their father's political machinations, and Jon God's Jon, who had spent 15 years in the heart of Lannister power and might now pay the price for Ned's actions. "You would threaten children." "I would protect my own," Cersei said coldly, "as any mother would. The question is whether you're willing to do the same." Ned looked around the throne room, taking in the armed men, the calculating faces, the trap that had been so carefully laid around him. 20 years ago he had stood in this same room and watched Jaime Lannister cut down the Mad King. Now he was beginning to understand how Aerys must have felt in those final moments, surrounded by enemies, watching his world crumble around him. But Ned Stark was not Aerys Targaryen. He had not spent years descending into madness, had not burned lords alive for imagined slights. He had simply tried to serve justice, and if that was to be his crime, then so be it. "I will not be silent," he said quietly. "The realm deserves to know the truth." Cersei's face hardened. "Then you've chosen your path." She nodded to Jaime, who stepped forward with his sword half drawn. But before he could clear the scabbard completely, the throne room's great doors burst open with a thunderous crash. "In the name of King Robert, Jory Castle's voice boomed across the chamber as he led a column of Stark guardsmen into the room. "Stand down!" Chaos erupted. The Lannister guards moved to intercept the Starks. Steel rang against steel, and suddenly the throne room became a battlefield. Ned drew ice in one smooth motion, the Valyrian steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. Jaime completed his draw and came at Ned with the fluid grace of a master swordsman. But Ned had been fighting longer than the Kingslayer had been alive. Ice met Jaime's blade in a shower of sparks, and the two men circled each other like wolves. "You should have taken the offer, Stark," Jaime said between strikes. "Now your family will pay for your pride." "My family knows how to protect itself," Ned replied, parrying a thrust aimed at his heart. "Something yours never learned." Around them the battle raged. Jory's men were outnumbered, but they were fighting for their lord's life, and that gave them an edge that gold could not buy. Ned caught glimpses of the fighting as he dueled with Jaime. Saw Jory himself cross blades with Sir Boros. Saw one of his men fall to a Lannister spear, but they were winning. Slowly, bloodily, but winning nonetheless. "Enough!" Cersei's shriek cut through the clash of steel. "Stop this madness!" But it was too late for that. Blood had been spilled in the throne room, and there would be no going back from this moment. Ned pressed his attack against Jaime, driving the younger man back toward the Iron Throne itself. "You want to know what your sister really is?" Ned said as their blades locked. "She's a kinslayer and a kingslayer in the making, and you're her willing accomplice." Jaime's face twisted with rage, and he broke the lock with a vicious headbutt that sent stars exploding across Ned's vision. But as the Kingslayer raised his sword for what should have been a killing blow, Jory appeared behind him with a dagger drawn. "My lord!" Jory called, and Jaime spun just in time to catch the captain's blade in his shoulder instead of his back. The distraction was all Ned needed. Ice swept up in a silver arc, and suddenly Jaime Lannister was on his knees, his sword hand injured to the bone and his weapon clattering across the floor. The fighting stopped as if a spell had been broken. Lannister guards found themselves surrounded by Stark steel, their golden-haired champion bleeding at the base of the Iron Throne. Cersei stood frozen, her face a mask of shock and fury. "It's over," Ned said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Surrender, and I'll see that you're treated with the dignity your rank deserves." For a moment he thought she might actually yield. Then Cersei's lips curved in a smile that chilled him to the bone. "Oh, Lord Stark," she said softly, "you have no idea what you've just started." She looked past him to where Petyr Baelish stood, seemingly untouched by the violence that had erupted around him. The Mockingbird gave her an almost imperceptible nod. "Kill them," Cersei commanded. "Kill them all." But instead of Lannister steel, it was the sound of more boots in the corridor that filled the throne room. Heavy boots, marching in formation, and when the doors opened again, it wasn't more Lannister guards who entered. It was the gold cloaks of the City Watch, led by their commander, but the man who should have been Janos Slynt was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a younger captain stepped forward, his cloak bearing the badge of his office. "By order of King Robert," the captain announced, "this gathering is disbanded. All parties will lay down their weapons and submit to royal justice." Ned felt his heart sink. The City Watch was supposed to be neutral, but gold had a way of changing loyalties in King's Landing. If they sided with the Lannisters— "Captain," Cersei said, her voice regaining its regal authority, "arrest Lord Stark for treason. He has attacked the royal family." The captain looked at her, then at Ned, then at the blood spreading across the throne room floor. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "I see a fight between lords, Your Grace. Nothing more, nothing less. And the king's justice applies to all equally." It wasn't the response Cersei had expected, and Ned saw her confidence waver for the first time. "You will do as I command," she said, her voice rising. "I am the queen." "You are the queen," the captain agreed. "But King Robert is still alive, and his word is law. And his last command to me was to keep the peace in his city, regardless of who breaks it." The implication was clear. The City Watch would not intervene on either side. It was a small victory, but an important one. Ned had feared that Lannister gold had purchased their loyalty entirely. "This isn't over," Cersei said, her eyes blazing with fury as she looked at Ned. "You think you've won something here? You've just signed your family's death warrant." "My family can take care of themselves," Ned replied. "The question is whether yours can." He gestured to Aemma, who was still kneeling in a pool of his own blood, his sword hand ruined. Your brother will live, but it'll take him some time to hold a sword the same way again. Your father will not be pleased when he learns how badly you've bungled this." The mention of Tywin seemed to drain some of the fight out of Cersei. She looked around the throne room at her wounded brother, at the dead guards, at the ruin of her carefully laid glass, and for a moment she looked less like a queen and more like a frightened woman who had gambled everything and lost. "Get him out of here," she said quietly, nodding toward Jaime. "Get him to a maester and get him treated as soon as possible." As the Lannister guards moved to help their wounded commander, Ned turned to Jory. "Casualties? 3 wounded, 1 dead," Jory reported grimly. "Could have been worse." Much worse, Ned knew. If the City Watch had intervened, if Jory hadn't arrived when he did, if any number of small things had gone differently. "We need to leave," he said quietly. "Tonight." "My lord?" "This was just the opening move, Jory. Cersei's right about one thing, this isn't over, and the longer we stay in King's Landing, the more time they have to bring their full strength to bear." As if summoned by his words, Petyr Baelish appeared at his elbow, his thin smile never wavering despite the carnage around them. "Leaving so soon, Lord Stark? But you've only just gotten started. What do you want, Littlefinger?" "To offer you some advice as an old friend. You've made a powerful enemy today. Cersei Lannister does not forgive, and she does not forget. If you're planning to run back to Winterfell, you'd better run fast." "And why would you help me?" Petyr's smile widened. "Because chaos is profitable, my lord. And you've just created more chaos than this city has seen in years. I'm simply grateful for the opportunity." Ned stared at the man who had loved his wife, who had betrayed his trust, who played games with human lives, as if they were pieces on a Sivas board. "You're mad. Perhaps. But I'm also right. You have perhaps 6 hours before Tywin Lannister learns what happened here. When he does, he'll mobilize every resource at his disposal to destroy House Stark. Your only chance is to reach Winterfell before he can strike." 6 hours. It wasn't much time, but it might be enough. Ned looked around the throne room one last time, taking in the scene that would haunt his dreams for years to come. He had sought justice, and found only war. "Jory," he said quietly, "gather our men. We leave within the hour." "Where are we going, my lord?" Ned looked toward the north, toward home, toward the family that was depending on him to keep them safe. "We're going to war," he said simply, "and we're going to win it." As they left the throne room, Ned could feel Cersei's eyes burning into his back. The game had begun in earnest now, and there would be no quarter asked or given. The Lannisters had raised Jon as one of their own, had taught him their ways, had made him into a weapon. Now they would learn just how well their lessons had taken root, and just how dangerous it was to threaten a pack of wolves, even if one of those wolves had been raised by lions. The breaking point had been reached. Now came the war. The sound of hoofbeats thundering across the cobblestones of Winterfell's courtyard shattered the peaceful morning like a hammer blow. Jon Snow looked up from the ledgers he'd been reviewing. Grain stores, weapon inventories, the careful preparations he'd been orchestrating since his hold of war preparations, and felt his blood turn to ice at what he saw. 3 horses, lathered with sweat and foam, their riders slumped in their saddles. He recognized them immediately. Jory Castle, Hal Mullen, and between them, barely conscious and held upright, only by their supporting arms, Lord Eddard Stark. "Guards!" Jon's voice cracked like a whip across the courtyard as he vaulted down the steps 3 at a time. "Get Maester Luwin. Now." The years at Casterly Rock had taught him to assess situations quickly, to see past the immediate chaos to the underlying truths. His father, and despite everything, Ned Stark would always be his father, was alive, but barely. Blood soaked through his traveling clothes, and his face was pale as fresh snow. This wasn't the result of bandits or common criminals. This was the work of lions. "What happened?" Jon demanded as he reached Jory's horse, helping to ease Ned down from the saddle. "Ambush," Jory gasped, his own face bearing the marks of recent combat. 2 days south of Moat Cailin, Lannister men, flying false colors. They were waiting for us. Jon's mind raced as he and Hal carried Ned toward the keep. An ambush meant planning, meant someone had known their route, their timing. It meant the game he'd been preparing for had already begun, and the first move had nearly been checkmate. "How many?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. 30, maybe 40. We had less than 20. Jory's voice was grim. "Lost half our men getting Lord Eddard out of there." The great hall erupted into chaos as they carried Ned inside. Servants scattered to fetch hot water and clean linens, while guards took positions at every entrance. But it was Catelyn's cry of anguish that cut through all other sounds as she saw her husband's condition. Ned! She was at his side in an instant, her hands hovering over his wounds as if she could heal them through will alone. What have they done to you? My lady. Maester Luwin appeared with his chain of office jangling, his weathered hands already reaching for Ned's pulse. We need to get him to his chambers immediately. These wounds need proper tending. As they carried Ned up the stairs, Jon caught sight of the other Stark children gathering in the hall. Robb's face was a mask of barely controlled fury, while Sansa looked pale and frightened. Arya stood with her fists clenched, and even young Bran seemed to understand that something terrible had happened. Jon, Catelyn called as they reached the Lord's chambers. Stay with us, please. Maester Luwin worked with practiced efficiency, cutting away Ned's bloodied clothes to reveal the extent of his injuries. 3 sword wounds, none immediately fatal but all serious. A gash along his ribs that had bled heavily, a thrust to his shoulder that had missed the major vessels by inches, and a cut on his leg that spoke of a fighting retreat. He'll live, Luwin pronounced after what felt like hours of careful examination, but it was close, very close. Another hour's delay. He didn't need to finish, they all understood. The men who did this, Robb said, his voice tight with controlled anger, they'll pay for it. They already have, Jory said grimly. We made sure of that before we left. Jon studied his half-brother's face, seeing the same righteous fury that had driven Ned Stark to King's Landing in pursuit of justice. It was admirable, but it was also predictable. Exactly the kind of response the Lannisters would expect from a Stark. This wasn't random, Jon said quietly, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. This was planned. Someone knew Father would be traveling that road, knew when he would be there. What are you saying? Catelyn asked. I'm saying this was Tywin Lannister's work. Or Cersei's. They tried to end this before it could truly begin. Jon moved to the window, looking out at the courtyard where servants were still tending to the exhausted horses. The question is why they failed. Failed? Robb's voice was incredulous. Look at him. He's alive, Jon said simply. If Tywin Lannister had wanted him dead, he would be dead. This was meant to be a warning, or perhaps a test. They wanted to see how we would respond. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Jon had learned to think like a Lannister during his years at Casterly Rock, to see the layers beneath the obvious moves. This attack had been carefully calibrated enough to wound and frighten, but not enough to guarantee death. Then what do we do? Catelyn asked. Jon turned back to the room, and for a moment he felt the weight of all those years of Lannister education settling on his shoulders. Tywin had taught him to be ruthless, Cersei had shown him the power of calculated cruelty, and even Tyrion had demonstrated that intelligence could be as deadly as any sword. Now it was time to put those lessons to use. We make them regret leaving him alive, he said quietly. Before anyone could respond, a commotion in the courtyard drew their attention back to the window. Another rider was approaching, this one bearing the colors of House Manderly. The man looked as if he'd ridden hard, his horse lathered and his face grim. More news, Jon murmured, but something in his gut told him this wouldn't be good news. They gathered in the Great Hall to receive the messenger, with Ned still unconscious in his chambers and Catelyn refusing to leave his side. It fell to Robb, as the eldest son present, to hear what the men had to say. My lords, the messenger said, his voice carrying the weight of momentous news. I bring word from King's Landing. King Robert Baratheon is dead. The words hit the assembled Starks like a physical blow. Jon felt the world shift beneath his feet, all his careful calculations suddenly thrown into chaos. How? Robb demanded. A hunting accident, my lord. His horse threw him during a boar hunt. He struck his head on a rock and never woke up. The messenger's voice was steady, but Jon could see the man's hands trembling slightly. They say he lingered for 2 hours before the end. Jon's mind raced through the implications. Robert's death changed everything. The balance of power, the succession, the very nature of the game they were all playing. With Robert gone, Joffrey would be king, and Joffrey was Cersei's creature entirely. When? He asked. News reached us some hours ago, my lord. Prince Joffrey has already been crowned. The small council declared him the rightful heir. Of course they had. Jon could picture the scene, Cersei moving swiftly to consolidate power, the small council falling into line, any potential opposition swept aside before it could organize. It was exactly what Tywin would have taught her to do. What of the other claimants? Robb asked. Stannis Baratheon? Renly? Lord Stannis has fled to Dragonstone, my lord. They say he's gathering his strength there. Prince Renly has declared for himself and is raising an army in the Reach. Civil war. The realm was about to tear itself apart, and House Stark was caught in the middle of it all. Jon could see the pieces moving on the board, could almost hear Tywin Lannister's voice explaining how chaos could be turned to advantage by those clever enough to exploit it. There's more, the messenger continued. Queen Cersei has declared Lord Eddard Stark a traitor to the realm. She's put a price on his head, 1,000 gold dragons for his capture, dead or alive. The great hall erupted in angry voices, but Jon barely heard them. His mind was focused on a single terrible realization. The ambush hadn't been a warning, or a test. It had been an execution that had gone wrong. Cersei had tried to kill Ned before he could reach Winterfell, before he could rally the North to his cause. She had failed, but she wouldn't make the same mistake twice. We need to call the banners, Robb said, his voice cutting through the chaos. All of them, every house that owes fealty to Winterfell. Agreed, Jon said, but his tone was thoughtful rather than angry. But we need to be smart about this just as we planned before. The Lannisters will expect us to march south in force, to meet them in open battle. That's what Father would have done. Why are you still suggesting it? Jon looked around the hall, seeing the faces of men who had served House Stark faithfully for generations. Good men, honorable men, but men who thought in terms of honor and duty rather than strategy and deception. I'm suggesting we fight like Lannisters, he said quietly, because that's the only way we're going to win. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he knew they were true. The game had changed. The stakes had been raised, and honor alone would not be enough to protect his family. I think you are right this time. Look where the honor has left Ned. Catelyn had returned from Ned's chambers, her face drawn with worry but her voice steady. Jon moved to the great hearth, where maps of the 7 kingdoms were kept. He spread one across the table, his finger tracing the borders between the various regions. The Lannisters have 3 main advantages, he began, slipping into the analytical tone he'd learned from Tyrion's lessons: gold, position, and the crown's legitimacy. We can't match their gold, and we can't claim the throne for ourselves, but we can undermine their position. He pointed to various locations on the map as he spoke. They control the Westerlands, but they need the Riverlands to maintain their supply lines to King's Landing. They have the crown's authority, but that authority depends on the other great houses accepting Joffrey's legitimacy. And? Robb prompted. And we make sure they can't hold what they've taken. We turn their advantages into weaknesses. Jon's voice grew more confident as the plan took shape in his mind. The Riverlands are your mother's homeland. House Tully has as much reason to hate the Lannisters as we do. The Vale remembers Jon Arryn, and they know the Lannisters were behind his death. Catelyn nodded slowly. Lysa will listen to me. And the Riverlands? Yes, they'll fight. More than that, Jon continued. We make alliances they won't expect. Stannis Baratheon has the better claim to the throne, and he knows Joffrey is illegitimate. Renly has ambition but no real support outside the Reach. We can work with that. You were talking about splitting the realm apart, one of the older lords said. The realm is already split apart, Jon replied. Robert's death saw to that. The question is whether we let the Lannisters put it back together under their control, or whether we make sure it stays broken until we can build something better. It was a cold calculation, the kind of thinking that would have made Tywin Lannister proud, but Jon had learned from the best, and now his family's survival depended on those lessons. There's something else, he said, his voice dropping lower. Something the messenger's news confirms. The attack on Father wasn't random, and it wasn't just about stopping him from reaching Winterfell. It was timed to coincide with Robert's death. The implication hung in the air like a sword. If the Lannisters had known about Robert's death before it happened, if they had planned the ambush to occur at the same time. You think they killed the king, Catelyn said quietly. I think they're capable of it, Jon replied, and I think we need to assume the worst about their methods and their reach. The great hall fell silent as the full scope of what they were facing became clear. This wasn't just a political struggle or even a war between great houses. This was a fight for the very soul of the 7 kingdoms, against enemies who would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. Then we stop at nothing to stop them, Robb said, his voice carrying the steel of absolute determination. Jon looked at his half-brother and felt a mixture of pride and fear. Pride at the courage Robb was showing, fear at the innocence that still colored his thinking. The Starks were about to enter a game where innocence was a liability and honor could be a death sentence. But they had one advantage the Lannisters have not thought about. They had learned from their enemies. Jon had spent 15 years in the heart of Lannister power, absorbing their methods, understanding their weaknesses. Now he would use that knowledge to protect the family that had claimed him, the home that had welcomed him back. Send ravens to every house in the north, he said, but be careful with the words. We're not calling them to war, not yet. We're asking them to come to Winterfell to discuss the realm's future. Let the Lannisters think we're still deciding what to do. And what will we really be doing? Jon's smile was cold and calculating, an expression that would have been perfectly at home on Tywin Lannister's face. We'll be preparing to show them exactly what happens when you threaten a pack of wolves, he said. Even wolves that were raised by lions. The calm before the storm was ending. Soon the realm would learn that House Stark had not forgotten how to bare its teeth. And this time they would bite with the cunning of lions and the fury of the North combined. The great Solar of Casterly Rock had witnessed countless moments of triumph and defeat over the centuries, but few as pivotal as this. Lord Tywin Lannister sat behind his massive oak desk, fingers steepled as he absorbed the cascade of ravens that had arrived throughout the morning. Each piece of parchment brought news that reshaped the political landscape of the Seven Kingdoms, and with each revelation his cold green eyes grew more calculating. King Robert Baratheon was dead. The official report spoke of a hunting accident, a boar, a thrown horse, a fatal blow to the head, clean, simple, tragic. Tywin allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Cersei had finally learned subtlety, it seemed. The girl who had once screamed and raged at every slight had matured into something far more dangerous. A queen who understood that the most effective murders looked like accidents. My lord? Sir Kevan Lannister stood at attention beside the desk, his weathered face betraying none of the concern that Tywin knew must be churning beneath the surface. His brother had always been the more cautious of the two, preferring measured responses to bold strokes. Robert's death was no accident, Tywin said quietly, setting down the raven from King's Landing. Our dear Cersei has finally shown some initiative. Kevin's expression didn't change, but Tywin caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Are you certain, my lord? The reports are exactly what they should be. Tywin rose from his chair and moved to the great window that overlooked the sea. From here he could see the harbor where Lannister ships waited at anchor, ready to carry gold or soldiers wherever they might be needed. A hunting accident removes Robert without creating a martyr. It allows Joffrey to ascend the throne without the taint of regicide. It was competently done. He turned back to his brother, noting the way Kevin's hand rested unconsciously on his sword hilt. Even here, in the heart of Lannister power, they all understood that the game had entered a new and deadlier phase. What of the North? Kevin asked. The reports from our men. Eddard Stark lives. The words carried a note of irritation that Tywin rarely allowed to color his voice. Wounded, but alive. The ambush failed. It had been a calculated risk, sending men to intercept Ned on the road home. Not enough to guarantee his death. That would have been too obvious, but enough to test his defenses, to gauge the loyalty of his men, to send a message about the reach of Lannister power. The fact that Stark had survived was inconvenient. Perhaps it's for the best, Kevin suggested carefully. A dead Ned Stark would have made him a martyr to the North. A wounded one might be more cautious, more willing to negotiate. Tywin's laugh was cold as winter wind. You don't know Ned Stark, brother. Wound a wolf, and it becomes more dangerous. Not less. He'll rally the North against us now, and they'll follow him into the fires of hell if he asks it of them. He moved to the great map that dominated one wall of the Solar, his eyes tracing the borders between the various kingdoms. The North was vast, sparsely populated, but fiercely loyal to House Stark. The Riverlands were Catelyn Stark's homeland, and they would likely follow where she led. The Vale remained an unknown quantity under Lysa Arryn's erratic rule. We have advantages, Tywin mused, more to himself than to Kevin. The crown's authority, the royal treasury, the loyalty of the Reach through the Tyrell's ambitions. But we also have problems. Stannis, Kevin said immediately. Stannis. Tywin nodded grimly. The king's younger brother had always been the more dangerous of Robert's siblings. Humorless, dutiful, and possessed of an iron will that would not bend easily to Lannister gold. He knows the truth about Joffrey's parentage. Robert may have been blind to it, but Stannis sees clearly. He'll press his claim. And Renly? Renly is ambitious but weak. He'll gather the Stormlords and perhaps some of the Reach, but he lacks the stomach for a real war. He can be dealt with. Tywin's finger traced the borders of the Stormlands, on the map. It's Stannis who concerns me. He has Dragonstone. He has a fleet, and he has legitimacy on his side. Kevin moved to stand beside his brother, studying the map with the eye of a seasoned commander. The North, the Riverlands, possibly the Vale, that's a significant coalition against us. Which is why we must move quickly to fracture it. Tywin turned from the map, his mind already working through the possibilities. Cersei will handle King's Landing. She has Joffrey on the throne and the small council in her pocket. Jaime will take the field with our armies. But we need to be smarter than our enemies expect. What do you have in mind? Tywin smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. We make them fight each other instead of us. Stannis and Renly both claim the throne. Let them bleed each other white while we consolidate our position. The North may rally to Stark, but they're far from the real centers of power. We hold the capital, we hold the treasury, and we hold the initiative. He moved back to his desk, where more ravens waited to be read. Reports from spies, updates from allies, intelligence from across the Seven Kingdoms. The network he had spent decades building was finally bearing fruit. There's something else, Kevin said hesitantly. The reports from our agents in the North. They mention increased activity around Winterfell, ravens flying to every major house, supplies being gathered, weapons being sharpened. Expected, Tywin replied, but his tone was thoughtful. Stark is calling his banners. The question is what he intends to do with them once they're gathered. March south? Perhaps. Or perhaps he's learned some caution in his times as the Hand. A direct assault on the capital would be foolish. We have too many advantages here. But if he were to move into the Riverlands, cut our supply lines, force us to fight on ground of his choosing, Tywin trailed off, considering the possibilities. It was a sound strategy, the kind of thinking he might have expected from someone trained in the art of war. But Ned Stark had always been more warrior than general, more concerned with honor than tactics. And there's another factor we must consider, Tywin said slowly. The reports mention that Jon Snow has now been coordinating Winterfell. Kevin's eyebrows rose slightly. The bastard? I thought he was still with us. He was, until Cersei's visit to Winterfell changed everything. Tywin's voice carried a note of genuine irritation. The boy's defection had been an unexpected complication, one that threatened to upset carefully laid plans. Jon Snow, Tywin had taken the bastard as a ward 15 years ago, ostensibly as a gesture of goodwill toward his defeated enemy, but in reality as a weapon to be forged and wielded when the time was right. The boy had been raised at Casterly Rock, educated by the finest tutors, trained in the arts of war and statecraft. He had been meant to be Tywin's creature, a Stark in name but a Lannister in loyalty. Instead, he had proven to be something far more dangerous, a true student. The boy learned well, Tywin admitted grudgingly. Perhaps too well. I had hoped to use him as a check on Stark ambitions, a voice of reason within their councils. Instead, he's likely advising them on how to fight us most effectively. Surely a bastard's influence is limited, Kevin suggested. Tywin shook his head. Not this bastard. I've read the reports from Winterfell carefully. Jon Snow has been organizing their defenses, coordinating their intelligence, planning their strategy. The hand of Lannister teaching is clear in everything he does. It was galling to admit, but Tywin prided himself on recognizing reality, no matter how unpalatable. The boy he had raised to be a weapon against House Stark had instead become their greatest asset in the coming war. What do we do about him? Nothing, for now. He's beyond our reach at Winterfell, surrounded by Stark loyalists. But wars create opportunities, and bastards are expendable. When the time comes, Tywin let the implication hang in the air. A knock at the solar door interrupted his thoughts. Enter, he called, and a young page hurried in with another raven clutched in his hands. Tywin broke the seal and read quickly, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he set the parchment down with deliberate care. More news? Kevin asked. From our friends in the capital, it seems Stannis has sent ravens to every great house in the realm, proclaiming Joffrey a bastard born of incest, and declaring himself the rightful king. The words hung in the air like a sword over their heads. It was one thing for Tywin to know the truth about his grandchildren's parentage, quite another for that truth to be proclaimed openly by a claimant to the throne. How are the lords responding? Mixed reactions. Some dismiss it as Stannis grasping for legitimacy. Others, Tywin's jaw tightened. Others are asking uncomfortable questions. It was a complication he had always known might arise, but had hoped to manage more carefully. Stannis's blunt proclamation had forced the issue into the open before the Lannisters were fully prepared to deal with it. We need to move faster than planned, Tywin decided. Send word to Jaime. I want him to march on River Run within the fortnight. If we can secure the Riverlands quickly, we can prevent Stark from linking up with the Tullys. And if Stannis lands on the mainland, then we deal with him as we dealt with the Targaryens. Tywin's voice was cold as ice. Decisively. He moved back to the window, looking out at the setting sun that painted the western sky the color of blood. Somewhere to the north, Ned Stark was gathering his strength. Somewhere to the east, Stannis Baratheon was preparing his fleet. The realm was about to tear itself apart, and House Lannister stood at the center of the storm. But storms could be weathered by those strong enough to endure them, and if there was one thing Tywin Lannister had learned in his long life, it was that strength was not measured in honor or righteousness, but in the will to do what was necessary. There's one more thing, he said quietly, not turning from the window. Send word to our friends in the Free Cities. If this war goes badly, we may need alternative arrangements. Kevin's intake of breath was audible. My lord, surely it won't come to that. It won't, Tywin agreed. Because we won't let it. But a wise man prepares for all possibilities. He thought again of Jon Snow, the bastard boy he had raised and trained and ultimately lost. There was a bitter irony in it. His greatest success as a teacher who taught from shadows had become his greatest failure as a strategist. The boy had learned too well, had absorbed not just the lessons he had intended to teach, but the deeper truths about power and survival. Now that knowledge would be turned against its teacher. Jon Snow would advise the Starks to fight like Lannisters, ruthlessly, pragmatically, without the constraints of honor that had always been their weakness. It would make them far more dangerous than Tywin had anticipated, but it would also make them predictable, because Tywin knew his own methods better than anyone, knew the strengths and weaknesses of the approach he had taught. If Jon Snow fought like a Lannister, then Tywin would know how to counter him. The game was entering its deadliest phase, with the highest stakes imaginable. The Iron Throne, the future of the Seven Kingdoms, the survival of House Lannister itself, all hung in the balance. But Tywin Lannister had been playing this game longer than any of his enemies had been alive. He had crushed the Reynes and the Tarbecks, had served as hand to a mad king, had navigated the treacherous waters of Robert's reign. He had built House Lannister into the most powerful family in Westeros, through careful planning, ruthless execution, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. He would not start accepting it now. Send the ravens, he commanded. To all our allies, all our agents, all our friends. Tell them the time for half measures is over. Tell them House Lannister remembers its debts and collects them in full. The lion's roar would echo across the Seven Kingdoms, and when the dust settled, only the strong would remain standing. And Tywin Lannister intended to be the strongest of them all. The clash of steel rang across Winterfell's practice yard as Jon Snow parried Robb's overhead strike, the impact sending vibrations up his arm. Around them, snow fell in lazy spirals, dusting the packed earth and making footing treacherous. But Jon had learned to fight in all conditions during his years at Casterly Rock. Sir Adam Marbrand had seen to that. Better, Robb grunted, stepping back and lowering his practiced sword. Jon rolled his shoulder, working out the stiffness that had settled there during the long hours he'd spent hunched over maps and correspondence. Hard to break old habits. In a real fight, that habit could get you killed. Robb's voice carried from where she sat on a wooden crate, while Arya encouraged him from sides. Thank you for the encouragement, little sister, Jon said dryly, earning a scowl from Arya. I'm not little anymore, she protested, and I can fight better than half the men in this castle. Jon didn't doubt it. He'd been working with Arya on her sword work since his return, building on the foundation Syrio Forel had laid in King's Landing. She was fast, clever, and utterly without fear, qualities that would serve her well in the dark days ahead. Speaking of fighting, Robb said, setting his practiced sword aside, what news from the Ravens? Jon's expression grew serious as he considered the morning's correspondence. Messages had been flowing into Winterfell like a river in spring flood. Reports from their bannermen, intelligence from their agents, News from across the Seven Kingdoms. Each piece of information added another layer to the complex picture he was trying to assemble. The Karstarks have called their banners, he said. Lord Rickard is marching to Winterfell with 1,500 men. The Umbers are gathering as well. Greyjon says he'll bring 2,000 from Last Hearth. And the others? Mixed responses. Some are eager for war, others are more cautious. Lord Manderly, while ready to fight, is concerned about the cost of prolonged conflict. The mountain clans are ready to fight, but they want assurance that we can actually win. Jon moved to where a map of the north was spread across a wooden table, weighted down with stones at the corners. Red pins marked the locations of their loyal houses, while black pins showed potential threats or unknown quantities. The real question, he continued, is not whether we can raise an army, but what we do with it once we have it. Robb joined him at the table, studying the map with the intensity of a man who knew his decisions would shape the fate of thousands. I think despite all your opinions, Father would march south, meet the Lannisters in open battle. Father is honorable, Jon replied carefully, but honor doesn't win wars against enemies who have none. It was a lesson he'd learned at Casterly Rock, watching Tywin Lannister orchestrate the destruction of houses Rhine and Tarbeck. The old lord had taught him that victory belonged to those willing to pay its price, regardless of what that price might be. Then what do you suggest now? Arya asked, hopping down from her crate to join them at the map. Jon traced his finger along the borders between the north and the Riverlands. The Lannisters expect us to march south in force to meet them where they're strongest. Instead, we make them come to us. But not here. Not at Winterfell. We have already drawn them into the Riverlands. There we have allies and they have extended supply lines. The Riverlands are Mother's homeland, Robb said thoughtfully. Uncle Edmure would support us. More than that, the Riverlands are the key to everything. Jon's voice grew more animated as the strategy took shape in his mind. Control the Riverlands, and you control the flow of supplies between King's Landing and the Westerlands. The Lannisters can't sustain a long campaign without those supply lines. Arya leaned over the map, her sharp eyes following Jon's reasoning. But what about King's Landing? They have the Iron Throne, the royal treasury. Gold is useful, but it can't buy you victory if your armies are starving in the field. Jon moved his finger to mark the key river crossings and roads. We make this a war of attrition, not a war of conquest. We bleed them slowly, make every mile cost them dearly. It was a cold calculation, the kind of thinking that would have made Tywin Lannister proud. But Jon had learned from the best, and now his family's survival depended on those lessons. There's something else, he said, lowering his voice. Something we need to discuss privately. Robb caught the serious tone and nodded. Arya, could you— I'm not leaving, Arya said firmly. Whatever it is, I'm old enough to hear it. Jon looked at his sister, his cousin. He reminded himself with the sharp pang that always accompanied that thought, and saw the steel in her gray eyes. She was right. She wasn't a child anymore, and the coming war would spare no one based on age or innocence. Very well, he said, but this doesn't leave the three of us. Not until we decide how to handle it. He moved away from the map, checking to ensure they were truly alone in the practice yard. The snow continued to fall, muffling sound and providing a curtain of privacy around their conversation. I know who my mother was, Jon said quietly. The words hung in the air like a sword over their heads. Robb's eyes widened, while Arya went very still, her hand instinctively moving to the hilt of needle. Father told you? Robb asked. Jon nodded. He tried before he left for King's Landing, though he did not at that time, but he did when he returned. He said it was time I knew the truth. The truth, even now, days after Ned had finally revealed it, Jon could barely process the magnitude of what he'd learned. Lyanna Stark, the aunt he'd never known, the woman whose memory still brought tears to his father's eyes, and Rhaegar Targaryen, the dragon prince whose actions had sparked a rebellion that reshaped the Seven Kingdoms. Who? Arya whispered. Jon looked at his siblings, his cousins, and felt the weight of secrets that could topple kingdoms. Lyanna Stark was my mother. And my father, was Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Robb sank onto a nearby bench, his face pale with shock. Arya's mouth opened and closed without sound, her quick mind racing through the implications. That makes you, Robb began. A prince, Jon finished. The son of the man Robert Baratheon died hating, raised by the man who helped kill him. It was a bitter irony that hadn't escaped him. Robert had spent 15 years calling him Ned's bastard, never knowing that the boy he'd allowed to live was the son of his greatest enemy. If the truth had come out then— "Does anyone else know?" Arya asked. "Father, Mother, Catelyn, she overheard Father talking to Lyanna's statue in the Godswood." Jon's voice was carefully controlled. "No one else. Father made me swear to keep it secret." "Why tell us now?" Robb asked. Jon looked at his brother, his cousin, and saw the same question in Arya's eyes. Why burden them with this knowledge, this dangerous secret that could change everything? "Because you need to understand what we're really fighting for," he said. "This isn't just about avenging Father's wounds or defending the North's honor. The Lannisters may know there are secrets that could threaten their power. If they ever suspected the truth about me—" He didn't need to finish. They all understood the implications. A living son of Rhaegar Targaryen would be seen as a threat to any usurper's dynasty. The Lannisters would stop at nothing to eliminate such a threat. "It doesn't change anything," Robb said firmly. "You're still our brother, you're still a Stark." "Am I?" Jon's voice was quiet, but it carried years of uncertainty and pain. "I was raised by Lannisters, trained by their masters, taught to think like them. Now I learn I'm the son of a Targaryen prince, and a Stark maiden. What does that make me?" Arya stepped forward and punched him in the arm hard enough to make him wince. "It makes you Jon Snow, you fool. The same person who taught me to fight, who helped Bran with his archery, who came back to Winterfell when we needed you most." Her words carried the fierce loyalty that was the hallmark of House Stark, and Jon felt some of the tension in his chest ease. Whatever blood ran in his veins, whatever secrets shaped his past, these people were his family. "She's right," Robb said, standing and clasping Jon's shoulder. "Blood doesn't make a man. Actions do. And your actions have proven your loyalty 100 times over." Jon nodded, grateful for their acceptance, but still troubled by the implications of his heritage. "There's more, Father thinks. He thinks there might be others who suspect. Varys, perhaps. Maybe even some of the Lannisters. All the more reason to win this war quickly," Arya said pragmatically. "Dead enemies can't reveal secrets." It was a cold assessment, but Jon couldn't argue with the logic. The game they were playing had stakes higher than any of them had imagined, and failure would mean not just death, but the exposure of truths that could reshape the Seven Kingdoms. "There's something else we need to consider," he said. "My education at Casterly Rock. Tywin Lannister didn't take me as a ward out of kindness. He was planning to use me somehow, to turn me into a weapon against House Stark. But you're here now," Robb pointed out. "You chose us over them." "Yes, but that doesn't mean I can't use what I learned there." Jon moved back to the map, his mind already working through possibilities. "I know how they think, how they plan, what they consider important. That knowledge could be our greatest advantage." He began pointing to locations on the map, his voice growing more confident as the strategy took shape. "Tywin will expect us to fight like Starks, honorably, directly, predictably. Instead, we fight like Lannisters. We use deception, misdirection, calculated cruelty when necessary. Sometimes I do think that Tywin will consider my opinions on this war, but I have already considered it and made counter-preparations. We need to be smarter if we want to survive." Jon's voice was hard, carrying echoes of lessons learned in the halls of Casterly Rock. "The Lannisters won't hesitate to use every advantage, every dirty trick, every ruthless tactic at their disposal. If we limit ourselves to honor and tradition, we'll lose." Arya nodded approvingly. "Good. I was getting tired of all this talk about honor anyway." Despite everything, Jon found himself smiling. Trust Arya to cut straight to the heart of things. She had always been the most pragmatic of the Stark children, the one least constrained by conventional expectations. Jon looked at the map one more time, seeing not just the geography, but the possibilities it represented. "We call the banners, but quietly. No grand proclamations, no dramatic gestures. We let the Lannisters think we're still deciding what to do while we prepare for war. And then we show them what happens when you wound a wolf that was raised by lions." Jon's smile was cold and calculating, an expression that would have been perfectly at home on Tywin Lannister's face. "We teach them that there are worse things than Stark honor to fear." The snow continued to fall around them, covering the practice yard in a blanket of white that muffled all sound. but Jon could almost hear the distant thunder of approaching war, the clash of steel and the cries of men who would die for the ambitions of their lords. He thought of Ned lying wounded in his chambers above, and of Catelyn who had accepted him as a son despite knowing the truth of his birth. He thought of Bran and Rickon, too young to understand the storm that was coming, and of Sansa. Most of all, he thought of the secret that burned in his chest like a brand. The knowledge that he was not just Jon Snow the bastard, but the son of a dragon prince and a wolf maiden, heir to a legacy of fire and blood that stretched back 3 centuries. The game was changing, the stakes rising with each passing day, but Jon had been trained by the best, had learned from masters of deception and strategy. Now it was time to put those lessons to use, to protect the family that had claimed him and the home that had welcomed him back. The dragon wolf's cub was about to show his teeth, and the realm would tremble at the sound of his roar.